A couple of months ago, I finally fulfilled a childhood dream. I made and released my first video game. It's called The Necromancer's Tower. It's a short first-person dungeon crawler based on old-school RPGs like Wizardry, Dragon Quest, and Phantasy Star. Now, it's not a very big game. You can probably beat it in just a couple hours or so, but it still feels really good to have something completed and out there. And the crazy part is, I made it in just 1 month. In this video, I'll talk about the process and what I learned from this experience to hopefully help folks out there who are trying to see their own game dev passion projects through to completion. But first, longtime viewers of this channel are probably wondering what happened to the science fiction themed RPG I was working on and off on for the last couple of years. That game's still in development, but it's also why I pivoted to making the Necromancer's Tower. See, that other game, which I'll just call the SciFi RPG for the rest of this video, it started out as a small, simple project, but it ballooned into something much bigger. Okay, not that much bigger, it's still a pretty simple RPG overall, but what started as a way for me to just bring some character designs and a world that I've had in my head for ages into fruition turned into a much more difficult task than I realized. Now, it wasn't feature creep or overambition that held up development, it was indecision. I mentioned this back in my previous devlog for the SciFi RPG earlier in the year, but one of the biggest things I struggle with is the seemingly infinite number of possible forms every piece of a game could take. I agonized for weeks over art styles, character designs, stat numbers, level layouts, literally everything. Even though I was making a game that featured just a handful of these elements, I just could never commit to a single idea for any of it. That's why there hasn't been much to show for it over the past couple years, despite how long I've worked on it already. So, I decided to do something about it. I set a goal. I would pause development on the SciFi RPG and make an entirely new game instead. I still wanted it to be a first-person dungeon crawler RPG, but I decided to keep things small, even smaller than the SciFi RPG. To be fair, I had this idea months before I ever started working on it. You remember that video I made earlier this year about using the original Dragon Quest as a template for small RPG products? Well, that was actually a product of me thinking about pivoting to a smaller game at the time. But it wasn't until a few weeks later, during the production of my Wizardry retrospective, that I finally decided what I was going to do. I was gonna rip off Wizardry. I mean, I just spent months playing, researching, and thinking about Wizardry, so it made sense. It might sound odd that I hadn't been inspired by Wizardry before then, but you have to remember the whole reason I started making a sci-fi RPG was because I wanted to make a dungeon crawler that wasn't traditional swords and sorcery fantasy like Wizardry, so I avoided it. But once the idea struck me, I just rolled with it. It seemed like the right path. Specifically, I was inspired by the Wizardry 5 port on the FM Towns Japanese PC system. This version retained the monochrome black and white wireframe dungeons of the earliest Wizardry games, but it features hand-painted enemy and character art, so I decided that was what I was going to do for my game, because I just thought it was a really cool aesthetic. But I also knew I needed to set some ground rules if I was actually going to follow through with this. So, I decided to limit my development time to just 1 month. Specifically the entire month of June 2022. I treated this challenge kind of like a game jam, where whatever I had at the end of the month would be my final game, outside of any necessary bug fixes I needed to handle after launch. I did this to keep myself on track and to make sure I stayed focused so I could come out on the other side with a finished game, playable from start to finish. That turned out to be the best decision I made during the Necromancer Tower development, and it led to the biggest lesson I learned in the entire process, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we talk about the big picture stuff, let's do an overview of the development process since I think it would be helpful to anyone else out there who's making a small RPG like this. Plus, I just really want to talk about how and why I made the Necromancer's Tower the way I did. My favorite part of the game dev process is the artistic stuff. You know, sketching and illustrating characters, plotting and laying out and decorating maps and levels, designing the menus and interface elements, that sort of thing. So that's what I spent the first half of the month on, even though this is basically doing game development backwards. Normally, the game parts, the code, the mechanics, the systems are built first, and then the art is made after the fact to fit all of those ideas. But I decided to go the other way to keep myself motivated. After deciding to stick with the Wizardry FM Towns look, I immediately got to work on the simplest art task. drawing the dungeon textures in black and white. I basically sat down and sketched out some rough wall ideas that you'd expect from a fantasy dungeon crawler. You know, brick walls, ornate stone walls, caves, etc. I also sketched a few sprites for stuff like treasure chests, locked doors, switches for puzzles. Then I jumped over to my iPad and I drew the sprites in RPG Maker MV's default 48 by 48 pixel ratio. Then I imported all those sprites into Photoshop, pasted them onto the default tile sets, and voila, all the dungeon art was done. And since I chose to stick with black and white for the walls and the floor tiles and only use a single color in 2 different shades for the sprites, the whole process took less than an hour. That early sense of progress really set the tone for the month. Instead of spinning my wheels trying to decide how everything should look, I just barreled forward. I let the sprites simply be whatever they ended up looking like. Once a sprite or a texture was done, I set it aside and I treated it as if it could not be changed. Next, I moved on to designing the enemies. Again, I just sketched ideas without any real goal or vision in mind. I didn't strive for a specific illustration style or thematic vibe, I just went with whatever I put on the page. What I ended up with were a bunch of skeletons and zombies. I decided from there that I'd make all the enemies in the game undead, or at least most of them, and I decided to stick with a dark fantasy theme for the entire game. That led me to decide that the best choice for a final boss would be a necromancer to control all these undead hordes. So by the end of the first day, I had a theme for the game setting, all the dungeon textures and maps done, plus about 6 or 7 rough sketches for enemy sprites. And while I wanted to just keep doodling ideas, I decided that was enough. After all, I would need to illustrate and format each of those enemies, which is a much longer process. And considering I was still working full-time during all this, I basically signed myself up for at least a week of enemy illustrations. Of course, that eventually turned into 2 weeks since I also had to draw the 4 hero characters. In fact, I had to skip several enemy designs and additional portraits for the party members that I had initially planned since I had already spent so much time just drawing and illustrating the enemies. Those first 2 weeks weren't just spent on art, however. I was also thinking up story ideas while drawing the characters. I didn't want to do anything huge, obviously. Ultimately, I came up with a simple scenario, like something from a one-shot tabletop role-playing session. The 4 heroes would find themselves trapped in the prison beneath the evil necromancer's tower. They were cursed to never die, but never escape the tower. Their bodies would slowly turn into undead servants if they couldn't find a way to break the curse. The whole point of the game would be simply to get to the top of the tower, kill the necromancer, and free themselves from the magic spell. Though I padded things out a little bit in places with minor NPCs and some simple side quests to find in the dungeon. With the momentum I had built from that smooth art phase, I jumped to the second half of the month. And I realized that while I had a bunch of art assets and a story scenario plotted out, I didn't have much of a game. But instead of coming up with entirely new gameplay mechanics, I stuck with the core RPG Maker battle systems, menu layouts, controls, dialogue systems, etc., except for a few plugins that I was already familiar with. So I followed my own advice and I used the original Dragon Quest as my main inspiration for much of the gameplay mechanics, including a system where your party is sent back to the beginning of the game with half their gold lost when they die, rather than experiencing a game over screen and having to reload from the last save. I also studied the enemy stats, combat equations, and character growth tables from other console RPGs like Dragon Quest II, Phantasy Star, and Shining in the Darkness. Those gave me a pretty solid blueprint for creating my own enemies, characters, spells, level curves, etc. I also figured this was a good opportunity to test some ideas I have for the SciFi RPG, albeit in a much simpler execution. For example, the maps. I wanted each floor to be fun to explore, and to me that means lots of shortcuts, treasure chests hiding worthwhile loot, and secret areas to discover. I studied the levels from Metroid 2 on the Game Boy as influence for my own dungeon layouts, since this game features smaller, self-contained levels that are fun to explore and have shortcuts that make it easy to retread your steps or get back to an area quickly. It's basically like a bunch of tiny little Metroidvanias strung along in a linear fashion, rather than a single big, contiguous world. And while ultimately I'd love to make a dungeon crawler that's more non-linear and Metroidvania-ish in its design, Metroid 2 proved to be the perfect template for a more streamlined, linear game with plenty of exploration still to be found throughout. To make exploration and backtracking smoother, I also made most of the enemy counters visible on the map, the majority of which don't respawn even after your party dies. However, this can introduce level imbalancing, so to prevent that, I also made occasional random battles that occur when the danger bar in the lower right of the screen fills up. There are also summoning signs on each floor that let you spawn battles against randomized groups of enemies. However, I didn't want players to feel like grinding against enemies was mandatory in order to beat the game. Instead, I emphasized stat growth through the equipment you found. I also made it so certain spells were only usable if you had specific items equipped, and a lot of the best gear in the game is hidden behind secret areas or special locked doors. This way, discovering a new piece of gear or finding a treasure chest with lots of gold that you can spend at one of the few in-game merchant shops feels like a major reward and a major step forward, all in hopes of encouraging more exploration. Not everything that you run into in the dungeon is helpful, however. I of course also included various events and traps and puzzles to keep you on your toes. Some of these are hidden traps that only trigger when you step on them. Others are visible on the map, some of which are good, others not so much. I'll be honest, I made these pretty difficult and unfair on purpose. I didn't have time to make in-depth events like I wanted, with stat checks or branching possible solutions like you'd find in something like Disco Elysium or Citizen Sleeper. Instead, they're all pretty much 50-50 coin flips. You're presented with a few options and you just gotta cross your fingers and hope you pick the right one, like Dragon's Lair or something. While that's pretty simple in this game, I really hope to expand on the traps and really all these gameplay ideas in future games. Anyway, these mechanics were actually a pretty simple thing to implement once I got things rolling. RPG Maker's eventing and scripting tools are super easy to use, and I kept things even simpler. The most tedious part was inputting all the stats in the character sheets, but I powered through it pretty quickly. Now, admittedly, the game isn't balanced at all, but I wanted combat to be difficult and the traps to be unfair, so it kind of worked out in my favor. I just had to make the enemy numbers bigger than the player numbers in most instances. Plus, that's why I added ways to grind levels in case you got stuck and needed to brute force your way past a difficulty spike against a boss or a random encounter. Surprisingly, that work only took about a week and a half. That meant I had about 3 days left in this whole challenge, and that's when I realized that I had no music or sound effects. So I scrambled over to OpenGameArt and grabbed some open source 8-bit RPG music packs. These compose the entirety of the music and sound effects in the Necromancer's Tower. With all that sorted, all I had left was to slap together some simple cover art and program the intro and outro cutscenes into the game. Or so I thought. Turns out, there were multiple bugs with the autosave system I had implemented and the party respawn structure. Not only was the game not autosaving at all, but it would also get stuck in a weird loop whenever the party died outside of battle, causing a black screen and soft-locking the game. Fixing the respawn issue was simple. I made it so the party can't be killed by traps, though they can take you all the way down to 1 HP, but no further. I also made the bishop immune to poison, the only damage-dealing debuff in the game, and the only one that can kill you while you're outside of combat, at least some of your characters. With the bishop immune, that means that you'll have at least one character in your party alive even if everyone else dies of poison. That way, your party can only finally die in battle, which avoids the respawn bug. It's an inelegant solution, but it works. The save system bug was easier to fix, but it was just a boring bit of plugin parameter editing that it's not worth going into. The important part is I was bug squashing up until the last day. And honestly, even after. I packaged and exported the game, I uploaded it to itch.io, and I made the store page. I sent a few download codes to my friends, and then I announced the game on Twitter. And it was less than 30 minutes later that someone was messaging me about more save game bugs. Luckily, it was a minor error. I accidentally left one of my test saves in the final release, which was causing some problems, and some folks still had issues with the looping black screen. I popped back into the editor, fixed the bugs, exported a new version, then uploaded it to itch. And then I did the same thing a day later because some folks were asking for a Mac and Linux versions, so I made those and exported those as well. So I guess I took a little longer than 1 month to get the game to a fully playable state for everyone. But hey, what game doesn't have post-launch patches these days, right? So anyway, that's how I made Necromancer's Tower. Now let's talk about what I learned from this challenge. And I don't just mean the technical stuff. I mean, yeah, I learned lots about how RPG Maker works. I feel like I'm better at making art for video games, and I developed a general game design skills like scripting, dealing with variables, even some light JavaScript coding. But the really important lessons I learned were the big picture stuff. I learned a lot about project management and aggressively controlling feature scope and make decisions, and the freedom that comes from making a decision. For so long, my biggest hangup with making games is feeling like I have to have everything figured out before I go into it, and then when I do, it has to completely match what's in my head. But what I've come to discover is that what you're making, what you're trying to complete, isn't the thing that's in your head. The thing that's in your head is motivation to make the final product, even though it's a compromised product. I kind of imagine it like the final game is reaching backwards into time to move me forward to make it, rather than me moving forward trying to make the perfect vision in my head. I know that's a really weird metaphor, but that's kind of what it feels like when I envision it. And I really think that that's an important thing that other game developers, especially first-time game developers and solo devs like me, should really take to heart. I mean, personally, it's very inspiring and liberating, and it makes it feel attainable. By not getting so worried about making it perfect of what I want in my head and just letting the game be whatever it ends up being as I'm making it, it makes it a lot easier to just keep moving forward with a project and to see it through. And you know, when people talk about how important it is to keep your games small when you're starting out so you can learn how to just ship a game, for the longest time, I just thought it meant learning the tools of whatever engine you work in. But really, what they're telling you is that you need to learn what it feels like to just finish something, because it's completely different than what it feels like to imagine something. And that's something that I've learned, you know, through making videos and through writing, but it is such a different beast when it comes to developing video games by yourself. One of the other big lessons that I learned isn't really about game development per se. What I learned from making the Necromancer's Tower is that there are tons of other small development studios and solo developers making games just like this, and that want to make games just like I want to. It's really inspiring. It makes me excited to keep making games and to keep talking about these niche games. Which kind of brings me to the last point here in this video, and that's, so what's next? Well, first, I am happy to announce that along with the Necromancer's Tower game, I am going to be repackaging all of the assets that I made for that game into an asset pack that other game developers can use. So if you have trouble making art, or you just want something to kickstart your own game project idea, these assets will be available for you to use if you download my game. As for what comes next for my own game dev projects, well, the SciFi Dungeon Crawler is obviously the next thing that I'm working on. I've been working on it for a long time now. I'm constantly thinking about it, but the reality is I needed to make the Necromancer's Tower to kind of reshift my focus and remind myself of what this game needs to be, what this game can be within my own skill level. And so I'm going to hopefully grab onto some of this momentum, and I'm hopefully going to channel that and make some real progress on the game in the future. I'll of course update all of you when I have something to show, but honestly, that's going to take a little bit more time than I anticipated, but I promise it's on the way, and I'm really excited to share stuff once I can. The other thing to bring up is my channel plans, because obviously making that game took a lot of time, making the wizardry video took a lot of time, and the last few months have been really slow in terms of uploads. Not that I necessarily have the most consistent upload schedule anyway, but I will have a bigger announcement when I have all of my plans in place. I know I spend a lot of time talking about old games on this channel, and I still plan to talk about lots of old games. In fact, I've got a couple big projects I'm working on right now for the rest of the year, but I do plan to talk about smaller games from niche genres that I really care about, that I think a lot of you will really care about, but that just simply don't get a lot of mainstream love and attention. And I will have more announcements on that and all this other stuff that I am alluding to in the near future. But, you know, I really just wanted to close the book on Necromancer's Tower for myself and share what I learned through this little game jam experience that I threw for myself. I really appreciate all of you for watching. I hope you learned something from this, or really just, you know, got some entertainment from hearing what it's like for me to make my first video game. I'll be back soon with another video. Until then, take care, and I'll see you in the next video.